Once again, we welcome you to this time of study of God's Word. For a few moments today, we want to look at some passages in Hebrews chapter 12, the first two verses. These verses talk about words of encouragement. You know, we as Christians often need words of encouragement because it's so easy to get discouraged while living the Christian life. Worldly pleasures, social pressures, physical afflictions, they can all take their toll on us, and they can discourage us and make us want to quit. However, we must not quit, because if we do quit, then of course we'll lose everything that we've worked for so many years. Now, it's nothing new about becoming discouraged. People throughout the centuries who've been trying to serve God have been discouraged. Some of God's greatest servants have been discouraged. We think about Jeremiah and Elijah, great men of God, prophets, and yet both of them got so discouraged at one time they said, "I'm quit. I'm doing no more." Well, how can we prevent becoming discouraged? Well, that's the question we're going to be looking at today. And I think in Hebrews chapter 12, the first two verses, we find three things that the writer tells us that will keep us from becoming discouraged. These verses read in these words, "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily besets us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God." Now, the first thing the writer tells us to do is to put aside some things, or lay them aside. He said to lay aside two things. One is the sin that so easily snares us, and the second are the weights that can slow us down. Now, we know what sin is. It's so easy for us Christians to keep some sin in our life. And we may justify it by saying, we all have problems. No one is perfect. You have your problems. I have my problems. And that's all true. We do have problems, and none of us can be perfect. But neither should we justify sin, as if sin is not a problem, and that even though I do have some sin, that's okay. It's not going to bother me. It does bother us. It can turn our attention away from God. It can ensnare us and stop us from running the Christian race. Then we also put aside some weights. Now, the weights are those things that are not necessarily wrong in and of themselves, but they can draw our attention away from the true focus. They can turn our attention away from Jesus. And that's what makes it so dangerous, when we find those things that turn our attention away from God. You see, even though things might not be wrong necessarily, they can easily take up too much of our time, too much of our attention, and therefore take away our focus from God. So we must lay aside those things. The second, then, we must run with endurance. Notice the writer here compares the Christian life to a race. Now, we all know that there are different lengths of races. Some races are very short, and they can be over in just a few seconds. Obviously, they do not require endurance. But the Christian race is not like those races. The Christian race is much more like a marathon. It is much more than emotionalism or simply a momentary spiritual experience. It is a life of service. And this life takes energy and persistence. This Christian life is not easy. But unless we run with endurance, then we can obtain nothing. You see, if we quit running the Christian race before the end, then we lose everything. You see, the Christian life is not a life where you can serve God for so long a period of time and then just quit, like you can retire. You know, we all have jobs, and when we get older, we look forward to a time when we can retire. That is, quit working like we normally did before and just kind of live off our savings or live off the government checks that we might get or other things. Therefore, we don't have to work every day like we used to. But a Christian life is not like that. You see, this life is not a time of retirement. The retirement in the Christian life is the next world. That's when there's no time to work. This life is a time of work, which means we must continually serving God all the days of our life. You see, we cannot quit. We must endure unto the end. And there's several verses in the New Testament that points out the need for endurance. Notice Galatians 6 and verse 9, Paul says, "Let us not grow weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap, if we do not lose heart." Notice Paul said we would reap if we do not lose heart. Thus the need for endurance. Earlier in chapter 6 of the book of Hebrews, writer referred to the example of Abraham, and he said that after he patiently endured, he obtained the promise. Only after enduring some things did Abraham obtain the promise. Similarly, Paul wrote in Romans chapter 2 and verse 7 that eternal life would be given to those who by perseverance in doing good seek for glory and honor and immortality. So in those verses, other verses we can mention too, which points out the need for endurance. And then the third thing the writer points out is that we must focus on Jesus. Or as the New American Standard said, we must fix our eyes on Jesus. Just as Peter began to sink when he was walking on the water in Matthew 14, when he took his eyes off Jesus, began to focus on the ways around him, so in like manner, if we take our eyes off Jesus, we can begin to sink spiritually as well. We can lose our focus on Jesus and therefore begin to get very discouraged. Jesus is the author and finisher of our faith. He helps us finish the race. But notice that Jesus succeeded in running the race by looking at the joy that was set before him. Now we might wonder how he could have joy while looking at the cross, because that's the joy that Jesus was looking at. Well, he was not looking at the joy of the cross itself, because obviously the cross itself did not have no joy associated with it. So he was looking beyond the cross. He was looking for the joy that came as a result of the cross. And basically that would be, of course, the joy of seeing his loved ones entering heaven. His spiritual brothers and sisters, mankind, that's able to enter heaven because of his great sacrifice. In anticipation of such joy then, Jesus endured the cross. And Jesus despised the shame of the cross. Now we often think about the pain of the cross. And indeed the cross is a very painful death. One of the most painful deaths that man has ever devised. But associated with the pain would be the shame, and we often don't think about that. To despise means to think little or to disregard. So Jesus did not think about the shame of the cross. It meant little to him. You see, the cross was reserved for the worst of all criminals. It was carried out publicly. And all the passers-by then would look up and see you hanging on the cross. They would see the crime for which you are being punished. And they will hurl ridicule at you. And we know that's what they did to Jesus as well. The passers-by looked up at him, "Save yourselves and we will believe you. Come down from the cross and we'll believe you." He saved others, but he cannot even save himself. But in spite of all that shame and the mockery that he endured, Jesus stayed on the cross. You see, Jesus looked at the joy that was set before him. And just as Jesus looked beyond the cross, so we must look beyond our physical and present sufferings. Look for the joy that will come before us as well. You see, whenever trials may come our way, and they will come, Well, when trials come our way, then we look to Jesus. And then our suffering will not seem like very much. Notice also in verse 3 of chapter 12, the writer of Hebrews said we must consider Jesus. Now, the word consider here is not used anywhere else in the New Testament. And it really means to draw an analogy. It doesn't mean just to think about, but it means to draw a comparison. Compare your sufferings with the sufferings of Jesus. Now, when we do that, of course, our sufferings is not going to seem like very much, because Jesus suffered everything we will ever suffer and much more, and he continued to endure. Just think about some of the things that Jesus suffered. Now, we think about the cross, of course, but even before the cross, think about some of the things that Jesus endured. Think about how weary and discouraged Jesus must have become over his lifetime. Times when his enemies would try to trap him. Times when even his own people did not believe him. It was the Jews who basically put him on the cross. His own family, his brothers, did not believe him when he was here on the earth. They thought he was crazy or he was out of his mind. Some of his own disciples, even the 12 apostles, were often the ones that seemed to have the weakest faith. You see, he experienced the greatest sufferings, and yet he received the greatest honor. We should think much more about the benefits from the cross than the temporary shame that might come upon us. That's what Jesus did. You remember, Jesus looked beyond the cross to the joy that came about as a result of the cross. And so in like manner, we need to do the same thing. Don't look so much about our physical sufferings at the present time, because that will soon fade away. But look beyond those sufferings to what is waiting for us. In Romans chapter 8 in verse 18, Paul says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us." Now notice what Paul was saying. He said, we look beyond the cross and we compare the sufferings of this present time with the joy that's waiting for us. And when you do that, then you really can compare. You can compare the two things. You look at the worst thing you have on this earth and the best thing you have in heaven, and they're not even comparable. It's like trying to compare apples and oranges. They're just two entirely different things. You cannot compare like that. Now, if Paul could say that, and he suffered much more than any of us ever will, if Paul could say that, I think certainly we could say that, couldn't we? You see, these words in Hebrews 12 were written to encourage some Hebrew Christians who were tempted to quit Christ, who were tempted to go back to Judaism, to their old life, and forget about Christ. Well, these words were meant to encourage them, and they can encourage us as well. Do not quit. Do not quit serving Christ. Do not stop serving God, because if you do, then you'll lose everything that you worked for thus far. I hope that you will look to Jesus for all the days of your life. Thank you.